Before we get started in this episode, a quick announcement. As you know, I'm very passionate about acceptance and commitment therapy, and I also run a busy practice in Canberra. We're currently looking for psychologists who are registered in Australia to join our team, who are also passionate about learning about ACT. We provide supervision on a group and individual basis and training around ACT. So if this is you, if you're interested, please express your interest at strategicpsychology.com.au/careers. Look forward to hearing from you. And now back to this episode.
Okay, life can be crazy. You're feeling like you're sinking, just trying to find a meaning. It's time for better thinking. Yeah, better thinking. Time to tune in. Let's go.
Welcome back to Better Thinking. My name's Nesh Nikolic, and my guest today is Dr. Celine van Golde, who is a senior lecturer in the School of Psychology at the University of Sydney. Her research focuses on the reliability of eyewitness memory in children and adults, both for one-off and repeated events. Celine has expertise in how interviewing techniques in forensic settings, such as those used by police, lawyers, and judges, can affect memory accuracy. She has used her research and knowledge to give lectures to the New South Wales Police Force child abuse training programs, as well as advising judges and lawyers on issues relating to eyewitness memory. Celine is also the founder and director of Not Guilty, the Sydney Exoneration Project, which assesses cases of potential wrongful convictions. While applying her work in a legal context, Celine's expertise lies within psychology as she tries to promote how research can be used to support vulnerable people, both children and adults, who go through the legal system. It was an honour to have Celine speak with me today, and also interesting to consider how vulnerable people are treated in the legal system, plus explore the general differences between adversarial and inquisitory models in law. Hope you enjoy today's episode. Celine, a big thank you for coming onto the program today.
Thank you for having me.
Really excited today with our topic being around the space of court and how children in particular are understood as witnesses, but also how that might also be different to adults, and looking forward to finding out all about it. And I know that you've written a book of late as well in this space, so you've got plenty to say.
Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it. I think it's important, as it's often misunderstood how accurate children can be and how reliable they can be.
It's really interesting because in many ways, children are so innocent, and so we do kind of think about them as being quite accurate in being able to provide at least some information, that we do take what they say as still being some type of information, and I know they're still used in many ways, whether it's during court or even before someone goes to courts, in family matters and the like. But it'll be interesting to find out more about how does this actual space play out, and what have your findings been, and and what are the considerations when thinking about children as witnesses, and their capacity to express information, how they can recall info, how they even encode info, and how reliable this space is. Because I know that, at least my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, that there's obviously some great challenges with even adults about being witnesses, let alone for children. So maybe you can begin that space for me and help me out a little.
No, absolutely. So in general, there's like a big background towards this. So if we look at the early 1900s and up to the 1970s, 1980s, children were often left out of any judicial process, even if they had been victimized themselves, because they were considered to be incapable of providing accurate information. And then, of course, a lot of research came into play. Psychologists were very interested in, well, what are the abilities of children? And from the 1980s towards 1990s, you see that the position of children within legal procedures changed, and all of a sudden they were allowed into courts to provide a testimony of what happens. However, due to quite some just issues that happened with how children were treated and specifically how children were interviewed, all of a sudden there was a lot of emphasis about like our children often get it wrong and they're easily manipulated. They can come to believe stories that never happened to them. They can be coached into providing certain statements, and people became very wary of children providing testimonies again reinforced a lot of research that then has shown that children can be very accurate and very reliable witnesses as long as they're asked the right questions, if their memory is treated the right way. And I think a common misconception, because of course children might be a little bit more vulnerable because their brains are still developing, and I'm talking here about preschool children, primary school children, but even up into adolescence. And we see that how their memory works is slightly different than adults, but technically they're not that different towards adults, because as you already alluded to, adults also can have a lot of issues in trying to recount what happened to them, especially if it was unexpected or one-off. So it all starts with the idea about how a memory works. Often the general population thinks a memory works a little bit like an old school video recorder, or like the video function on your phone, where once you're observing something or something is happening to you, then it's like clicking that record button and everything that you witness and all the details just get stored in your brain. And then once you want to recall that information at a later point, it works a little bit like Netflix, where you select the season, you fast forward to, like, you select the episode that you want to recall, you fast forward to the specific scene, you pause the screen, and in your brain, you can describe every single detail what you see on the screen. Now, unfortunately, our memory doesn't work like that. So our memory is reconstructive. And this means that every time that we recall a specific event, there's different factors that will impact what we recall and how we recall it. And this can be, for example, who we're talking to, because if you're talking to your friends, you're going to recall a specific party that you went to completely different than if you're talking to your parents, or if you're talking to an authority figure, for example, or to your kids. If you're very happy when you're trying to recall a memory, your memory will also be more happy than if you're very sad at the time. So these are factors that are already just influencing our memory overall. But then there's also other factors, of course, that will influence the different stages. So you already were talking about encoding. So this is when we're actually experiencing events and we take all the details, we take all the information and we encode that into our brain to be stored for later retrieval. We see that there's obvious factors and less obvious factors that will affect what we encode. So if we're very close to an event, we will see a lot more details than if we're very far away when we witness it. If it's very dark when we're witnessing it, you can't see as much as if it's very bright. But there's also less obvious factors. So, for example, age. We know that very young children will encode information differently than adults. And also older adults will encode it differently. And that is because we have different pre-existing knowledge that will enable us to understand what's going on and help us actually, I recognize what is going on, I understand what this is, and help us encode the information. Young children don't have all these experiences yet, and for that reason might not encode all the details. Then if we look at storages as well, it's like how you then have that information, you provide it usually with a specific tag, so that if you later want to recall it, you just search for that tag, that specific cue. If we're watching a car crash, we tag all those details as car crash in our memory, and how we tag it and the type of cues that we attach to it and the network that we develop within our brain during storage will determine what we'll retrieve later. And then retrieval, which is that third stage of memory, is when we dig into it and try to get it out. And this is where we actually have the most influence as external people on how adults will remember, because the questions that we ask, suggestions that we provide during those questions will determine how people remember specific details. in general, our memory decays very rapidly. So specifically, if there's a one-off event, then we see that we forget the majority of the details within the first few hours after experiencing it. And then it plateaus out about around 30% of the details we'll remember. It's not arbitrary what we forget. It's usually the central details. So that grabbed our attention or what's potentially caused us stress. That's what we focus on. That's what you'll remember the longest and for a long period of time. And it's more those peripheral details, which can be important to a police investigation, but are not important to your experience, that you'll start to forget more often. Now, this happens to everyone, children, adults, older adults. But what we see is that children have a little bit, so first of all, with encoding, it's a little bit more difficult because they don't know what to pay attention to. They don't have pre-existing knowledge to actually, for it to make sense, to then store it in a coherent way. And we also see that they struggle a little bit more with retrieval, and we need to help them systematically search their memory and actually retrieve the information, because it's just something that you learn over time. How to actually effectively use your memory, cue yourself, retrieve information. So this works the same for everyone. Everyone has the same issues, but children are just at a little bit more disadvantaged because they're still developing certain skills.
It makes sense with the theory in mind that if young people are not sure what to encode because they don't have pre-existing patterns, they're just trying to encode the whole of it. And we know that that exhausts the memory capacity. And so, a lot of things can be missed, but it's trying to put potentially a relatively high priority on everything. Yeah. Not knowing, actually trying to sift out what are the patterns in life. And until those patterns are just established, there's obviously a lot of challenge in that encoding, and therefore, also in challenging actually storing and keeping all of the data, when in actual fact you don't need all of that, and it's very high cost to try and store all of it, and hence where the retrieval then becomes quite difficult. They need lots of prompts or assistance to say, can you recall other things, or what else was there at the time that they can go, I didn't even think about that, but can I now look back and try and see what was there? It makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And at the same time, it's also like almost that can happen. And also the reverse, where for them, they can focus on something that is familiar to them, or that they are very interested in, but that we wouldn't even have paid attention to. And so they have very good memory of the specific, but there was like a fire truck. And you're like, but at the same time, someone got murdered over there. Why are you looking at the fire truck? But that is like relevant to them. So they also pay attention to different details that they will focus on and remember because they are relevant to them and it makes sense to them. Or they are experiencing, and this is often, unfortunately, due to the nature of the crimes that children are most exposed to, which are usually abuse and sexual abuse type in nature, is that they don't quite understand what is happening to them. And if you don't understand what is happening to you, or what a specific action is, or what something entails, then how are you going to remember it? It's like coming across like a weird, awkward thing for the first time, an object, and you're just like later on have to describe what it is. Like, unless you know what the function is or the name or anything like that, it's difficult to remember it or describe it even later on. And often with very young kids, it's the very first time that they experience certain things, and they might not have the words or the understanding to describe what was actually happening to them. So how are you going to store that information?
Let alone then actually be asked about what was the room like and where was the door situated and so on and so forth. All the other peripheral detail at that point, it all actually becomes quite difficult.
Yes. And
other than those things that grab their attention specifically, that actually become points of interest to them in that moment. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think like it's even difficult for adults, so let alone for children, because we know that adults struggle as well within these circumstances. There's so much research that shows how easily memories can be changed in adults. And we always blame the children and say like, oh, but they're very unreliable. And I'm like, it's everyone. And actually the duty is with the person interviewing the child, because they can really, or talking to the child, they can really determine how accurate and how reliable it is, because the information is there. We just need to use proper techniques to get that information out.
I might be jumping the gun, and I probably am, but my mind wants to go there.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's research that looks at how memory changes when it's in a courtroom versus how memory is outside of a courtroom. And I ask this question because I've observed in a courtroom two police officers being asked the same, being asked about the same event.
Yep.
And there were even there were questions that were asked, like, for example, the sirens, sorry, the lights, how were they situated on the vehicle? And the tactic from the barrister was really to try and discredit the witness. But interestingly, it seemed to me like the police officers probably wouldn't recall that, because it's such a peripheral item, a memory to even encode. Why would a police officer even care about whether it was a light that you pop on the top of your, cabin car, or whether it's, a big long one or whatever it might be. But it almost felt like the police officers tried to save face by giving an answer rather than saying, I don't recall. And it almost looks like, that would come under the, position of that's a false memory, because one of them had to have had a false memory if they both had different responses, and therefore puts into question their credibility. But I wonder if there is research that looks at witnesses actually saying things, because it's so daunting in a courtroom, rather than saying, look, I don't recall, because that can look a little bit foolish, or it can look like, maybe you're not trying to be a good witness or participate. It's always like you're compelled to say something. That's what it looked like for these police officers. So maybe I'm jumping the gun, but it's the question that's come up for me.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. So the majority of that research is focusing on leading questions, and if people are willing to say, I don't know. There's actually a lot of research with children. So if we look at the majority of protocols that are set up to interview children, and there's different protocols around the world, but technically they follow quite a similar structure, where it's very important to set ground rules at the start of the interview. So you build rapport, and then you set the ground rules. And some of the ground rules are that if you don't know the answer, please don't guess, but just say don't know, exactly for that reason.
Is this when speaking to children?
This is when speaking to children.
Okay,
yes.
Yep.
And what you see now is that there is an emphasis as well on vulnerable adults, and they use the same type of interviewing structure more and more as well, because they've recognized vulnerability in adults. Then where they say things like, I wasn't there, so I do not know the answer. So if I'm saying something wrong, or if I repeat the question, it's not because I think you are wrong, but it is because I just want to double check, or that I've understood it right. And you really put the power with the child and really make clear that please feel free to say if you don't understand something, if I need to rephrase a sentence, of course, like in more child-friendly language. And please say, I don't know, because there's a lot of research that shows that children, when they have an unanswerable question, they will provide you with an answer. It's super cute. And if you YouTube it, you'll find like a lot of videos, and they ask children questions like, what is bigger, milk or water? And what you see is that children will try to answer that question, and they have like 4-year-olds and 7-year-olds. And then they both will try to answer that question. And especially if you keep on repeating the question, And the older they are, they actually will come up with justifications. So they will say like, oh, well, milk is bigger because water is see-through. So, and milk is like wide and you can't see through it. So for that reason, it's bigger. Or they say what is heavier, red or yellow. And children are very inclined to provide you with an answer. Now, of course, that is a cute demonstration about how they'll come up with an answer. But then if within an interview context, what this means is if there's an answer that they don't know, if there's a question they don't know the answer to, rather than saying, I don't know, they're more inclined to just come up with something. And the older the children are, and this is like, these are primary school children, they are more likely to justify it. And as an interviewer, at that point, it becomes unclear, like, do they actually know this? And especially when there's a justification, then it's like, well, but they even provided a justification. And for that reason, it's so important that you set those ground rules at the start. Now, when it comes to adults, it's assumed like, well, adults wouldn't go along with it. But of course, adults are going to be intimidated as well, especially in the court context, where it's all set up to trick them into answering. And defense is there to actually create reasonable doubts that their defendant, that their client is not guilty. And they will need to, well, they have to just create reasonable doubt towards the story of the prosecution. But even adults are very easily tricked into trying to answer. And you see it, especially with this, the research on how people respond towards questions of barristers and under cross-examination shows that they are very easily go along with the questions, and especially if they are suggestive or leading questions as well. And it's difficult to protect yourself. There are some witness preparation courses, but that is depending on what country that you're in and what type of legal system that you're in, that isn't always allowed. But it is really tricky to stand, because I think the main problem, both with children and with adults, is that especially if you're a witness, like, you're there and you want to help, you want to get the truth out. So if they ask you a question, you'll give it your best guess because you don't quite know, and that can actually go against you because it can undermine your credibility if you're proven wrong within that answer. And we are all taught that we should be compliant with authority figures. You never talk like, oh, go against what the police says or go against what the judge says. It's always like, respect those people, go along. So it's not in our nature to easily say that. And also, I don't know, is not an easy option. Like, not a lot of people want to acknowledge that they don't know. So it can be such an ingrained type thing that you don't want to acknowledge that you don't know an answer. That both you want to help, and at the same time it's that, I don't want to give in to saying I don't know, that you go along with what is said or you provide a guess.
And I imagine that once we form or express an opinion like, milk is bigger than water, that leads to the next thing. If someone repeatedly, and that was that aspect that you said, if a child is asked repeatedly, it almost insinuates there is a correct answer. And so the child is likely to guess. And it's reasonable to guess that milk is the heavier one on average more of the time because it looks like it's solid rather than clear. Yeah. That's a reasonable way to think as a young person. If someone's being insistent on tell me the answer, you're then more likely to go and say, well, which one's the heavier one?
Yeah.
So it follows the narrative, it follows the reason. And so it all of a sudden, it changes the memory, or it just influences the memory, or it just starts to, be almost manipulative rather than, makes that child very vulnerable.
Absolutely. And if you think about it, like, in every other context that a question gets repeated to a child, it is often because they either said something wrong or there is a correct answer. Because if you look at classrooms, they think, what is the capital of France? And they give an answer, and it's like, now think really hard. What is the capital of France? Or are you sure about that? Do you want to have another guess? And often it is like, when you repeat the question, it's like, there was something wrong with your first question. So for that reason, especially if you've got these leading repeated questions, children have been taught from experience, I might want to change my answer towards this. And it's what you brought up as well. It's like, especially within, for example, with your two police officers, the adults, is if you forget certain details, it's the leading questions that come in there that then fill in the gaps. You're like, oh, well, I wasn't quite sure about what that light looked like, but my other colleague said, or the lawyer just suggested XYZ. Or it can even be like your pre-existing knowledge. Like in every car that I've driven, that is where the light is situated. So I assume it's in the same place. And this is where scripts come into play. And that's quite important within both children and within adults' memories, is that we develop scripts about activities that we experience every day. And a lot of our memories are actually based on those scripts because we remember very script consistent details. We've got scripts, for example, ordering coffee somewhere. Like you go into the cafe, you go up to the cash register, you provide your name, your coffee order, you pay, you wait around, they will call your name and you'll pick up your coffee. And so we can remember every time when somebody asks us like, what usually happens when you go and order your coffee, you will come up with those details. And if they ask you like, hey, last week when you ordered coffee, can you tell us what happens? And you'll base your memory on like, oh yeah, this is what usually happens. And then was there anything that deviated from my normal script? But these scripts really help us not only encode the information and store the information, but also retrieve the information. And what we see is that as soon as something deviates from the script, it can either help us, but it can also become problematic. So little things that changes in between scripts can be more difficult to remember, and especially for children. We are very good at remembering the script consistent information, but then the slight changes in between the specific episodes can be really difficult to determine, what episode was it actually that I got an extra sugar, or they made a mistake and spelled my name wrong. Or if they say like, what day was that? It's like, I don't know it happened, but if you ask me what specific day, it becomes really difficult. And that is what we often ask children to do. A lot of the crimes that they are being interviewed on are these repeated types of crimes. It's often like not a one-off event, not that they don't exist, but often children are interviewed about repeated types of events. And it used to be that they actually had to particularize specific details to specific dates and times. And can you imagine like asking a 4-year-old what happened 2 months ago on a Tuesday, when like they don't even know what 2 months ago, the concept of time and yesterday, before, after is really difficult. And based on the research that has been done, they've actually changed a lot of the legislation and requirements now. So rather than asking for children to particularize these specific details, it's now just like the child claims it happens between the 1st of January 2018 and the 31st of December 2022. Then they mention specific details that happened, but they don't actually have to say what date, what time. They just talk about specific events within that time span. And that is now allowed for children to recall that. And that is based on, yes, they can be very, very accurate about specific events, but to try to particularize that's almost impossible. And
I imagine, sorry, Celine, to jump in, but I imagine that gets extremely blurry when there's multiples of events, So, a car crash is probably a little bit easier to recall some of the detail because it's a one-off car crash. But when there's something like domestic violence, and it's like, well, which one of the 70 instances are we talking about? And probably, they were the serious instances. There's probably another 300, which were, just the yelling variety and slamming of doors and so on. How am I supposed to recall that? They become one big blur. And I don't know whether it was this date or that date. I can't even remember, was it, before dinner or after dinner? Like who knows? Often they would happen before and after dinner. So how could I possibly, or during dinner as well? It's a ludicrous thing, for us to even think that our memories,
Yeah.
even
It's
the best,
capable.
even the best adult mind
Yeah.
cannot recall what once there is. I'm assuming here, so please jump in. But I assume the best mind can't go out and recall those types of details because of the sheer confusion that's brought in by multiple events. How do I recall now of one event that happened 9 months ago,
Yeah.
or let's say 18 months by the time you get into court,
Yeah.
when there was so many.
Yes. And it's like, and so it's really good to see how the legal system has adjusted to that understanding about, like, well, for children, it's impossible to do that. But it's only quite recently, like in the last 5 to 7 years or so, that we've been researching the same for adults. Well, as you already said, within adults, we've got like domestic violence victim survivors that go through exactly the same. It's multiple very similar type of events that might slightly change, but they are still expected to particularize. And when it gets to court and they are being cross-examined by defense, which is already quite re-traumatizing when they have to face the defendant in court, they are then being scrutinized and attacked for misremembering details. Well, you said this happened on this specific day, but I can prove that my client was overseas at that point. So I put to you that you're lying about this. And if you're lying about this, you're lying about everything. And it becomes really complicated. So it's very important that we look at these types of things. And there's a lot more research now. But research doesn't mean anything if it then doesn't also get translated in how we prosecute these types of events and what we expect and what we can realistically expect from victim survivors and witnesses to remember. And luckily with children, these adjustments are being made. But it's still amazing to see that's how defense responds to statements from children at times. And they've learned.
Can you give some examples?
I'm often asked to be an expert witness to evaluate the interviews that are being done with children, and then specifically to show, like, often the first thing that defense will try to use is like the child has developed either a false memory or is being coached. And then based on, and they say, oh, we went through the recorded interview and we see all these inconsistencies. And like, inconsistencies doesn't tell you a lot about the accuracy of a recollection, because it is very normal to have inconsistencies. We have inconsistencies between retelling. It's just the nature of memory. So we see that often defense barristers are looking for wrong signs, but those are the signs that they hang on to, trying to prove that a statement might be like a lie or coached or inaccurate. So it is unfortunate.
How would one understand those differences? Like, we clearly observe children being coached, and I mean, my children are coached. I'm trying to coach them about how to interpret the world, how to respond to the world appropriately, at least what I believe is appropriate. There is coaching occurring, and obviously trying to manipulate them into being better human beings, or, to develop. And obviously there's other forms of coaching, like, I want you to tell this story when you go up and, police talk to you, or, if you have to go to court. Yeah. What are the elements that are telltale, or not telltale, because I'm struggling with the language, but what are the factors that are looked at to try and understand, when can you tell a child, not with complete accuracy, but with some value attributed to it, that they're actually being coached versus they're making errors in their memory?
I think it's important to note that there's actually not, like, there's often a belief with these types of things that people are trying to set up children to coach, but the actual type of children, the actual cases, number of cases where children are blatantly lying or being coached to say things that didn't happen are very, very low. Like, the majority of these cases are I would say the vast majority are real disclosures. Now, one thing that you can look at is how and when the child disclosed, who they disclosed to. But specifically, what research actually has shown that even when children are coached to say something, if you ask them to promise to tell the truth, they'll actually tell the truth even when they were coached. And it is
Oh,
especially the
wow.
really young ones.
Isn't that cute?
It is really cute, and it's not just done with like kids that hadn't experienced, but even with kids that had experienced these types of situations or that had been abused, and then they tried very ethical experiments where they try to coach them to say certain things. As long as you ask them, especially the young ones, to promise to tell the truth, they would. A little bit older children will potentially lie to protect someone, but they're actually more difficult to coach in the first place. So if something happened to them, they're less likely to actually lie about it. So it's only when they want to protect someone else that they might be doing it. But again, asking them to promise to tell the truth will actually overcome a lot of those things, and they'll end up telling the truth. So I think we don't have to worry too much about coaching. And so when
Sure.
lawyers talk about that, or ask me, then it's often like you look at the disclosure, you look at the interview, and if they promise to tell the truth and you hear the details, it's very clear that they're.
And is that somewhat because we do tend to revert back to our nature? So even with adults, when they're coached, they, as much as they can do some of it, once they're on the stand and, you know, the stress is on, the pressure's on, we revert back to our nature. We're back to our norm, so to speak, our natural biases. And, you know, we might learn some aspects, but for the majority, it's such a made up performance that the whole thing is that it's very difficult to coach for something that you've never been in. You know, it might be different if you're being coached, but you've been to court 30 times, you can then play a role. But for the first time, for most, which, you know, most people probably don't even have to in their lifetime, but for those who do, very difficult to put on a performance without it either looking really stupid, because you're trying so hard that it's so unnatural and it looks a bit nonsensical, or you just revert back to, you know, your standard. And for a little kid, it might be, I'm actually trying to protect mummy or daddy because I don't want them to be in trouble. And you can kind of see some of that starting to show up as an example.
Yeah, but then even when you ask them, like, promise me to tell the truth, they will actually still say what really happened, because children are very honest at heart.
It's beautiful. It's beautiful. So they're actually quite reliable, I'm assuming then, at a specific age potentially, that they're a bit more reliable.
They are more reliable.
You know, giving them enough scope. I'm assuming you can't ask for real detail if you know they're unlikely to you know see an aspect, or they're very good with detail as well.
Well, they can be very good in detail. So you see a lot of individual differences, but you see that in adults as well. Like some people will remember more details than others, and exactly the same for children. Okay. And what you see is that even if you look at 2.5 and 3-year-olds can recall events that happened to them a few months before in quite a lot of details. And those are young kids. And of course, the older you get, the bigger your capacity to remember different types of things. But the majority, the biggest part is if they paid attention to the details. So, and if it made sense within their context, and within their scripts that they already have in pre-existing knowledge and concepts. So they can be really accurate and very detailed. And I think the bigger problem, though, is that it's not about the intention, but it is if we ask the wrong question or if we provide them suggestions, they might be more likely to go along with it than adults, or they can replace certain information if they have gaps in their memory with the suggestions that we provide them with, just like adults do.
I remember one of my placements when I was doing my university studies was with child protection, and I was very fortunate to watch some practitioners interview some kids in some, I suppose, investigations to ensure the safety of children, and they were so good. The way that they would ask questions and the environment and making sure they felt safe, that they weren't being led. Clearly the training, at least at the time here in Canberra, I was really impressed with how a child wouldn't have probably felt so afraid, even though there would have been, there was two adults in the room that were complete strangers to them. They'd been pulled out of their classroom. But, there was a teacher that, was potentially there to assist and support. So there was some familiarity, and it was lots of extremely open questions, not trying to point in any direction. And also not giving signs of that's a good answer or a bad answer, or, kind of coming back to spaces, not necessarily just following it the whole way through. Like, I just thought, wow, this is something that is so specialized. To actually ask children questions in a non-leading way to ascertain the actual, at least, trying to find truth, is such a skill, because of the ease at which you could manipulate, as you say, even with just repetitiveness, is something that they're accustomed to. I know when I'm teaching my children to read, I might say, try again, because they've just skipped over a word, which is exactly how you learn to read, right? Yeah. You just kind of run with the sentence. You've got a script in your mind. That's what it should say. So you just run. Yep. And, I'm asking my daughter to kind of pay a bit more attention to read it. But yeah, I thought it was absolutely, it was almost like an art. It seemed to me, at least, quite artistic. It was beautiful.
It absolutely is. And it's so important what you say, not just to have those open-ended questions, but to also not provide that feedback towards like what you say is right or wrong. And that is what is often, you can ask all the right questions, but it's also how you ask the questions. And it can be the tone that you use or your nonverbal behavior that can influence the children. So it sounds like, as you said, it is a very specialized skill. So luckily, within the majority of, within every police force within Australia and all the different states, you only specialized officers will talk to children and will interview children. But if we look at European countries, and specifically some of the Scandinavian countries, they won't even let police officers necessarily talk to the very young children. They have specifically trained psychologists to do those interviews, because they say it's so important, and it's so important to get it right. And and we cannot expect that from police officers who do so many other tasks and need to have so many different skills. Like, as you said, it's almost an art to be able to do this. So for that reason, you just need to have people that are specifically trained just to do this, and not expect them to do all these other things. And I think we are definitely getting somewhere in Australia. There's, of course, things that can still be improved, but you see different states making a lot of adjustments to accommodate for this. Like within New South Wales, they did it for a couple of years, had a trial, but they are now actually going to implement it everywhere within Australia. Is that they do the initial interview, they give the evidence in chief. So this is technically when the child would testify in court and be questioned by the prosecutor to give their statement. And then also the cross-examination from the defense barrister. They all pre-record this as soon as possible after they have disclosed the crime, and also when charges are being pressed against the defendant. And then both the evidence in chief and cross-examination, that recording can be used in court. So the child actually doesn't have to come to court, sometimes years after this has happened, to come and testify there. So they can, it is both closer to when it actually happened, so memory is fresher, but at the same time you overcome a lot of the stress that is involved with having to go testify, having to be cross-examined. By doing it within a room, they have intermediaries now also that are there to, similar to what you said about having a teacher there to make sure that there's someone that has the child's best interest at heart, that can step in if questions are being asked in a way that the child might not understand. And they have now this program which is going to be brought out all over Australia, because they only had it in specific children courts. But they're introducing it everywhere, and hopefully different states will follow a similar path.
It seems like that's potentially beginning to lean a little bit more towards the inquisitorial model of saying, if we can, at an early level, inquire and try and ascertain information when the memory is going to be its strongest, without undue stress and pressure, with obviously very trained people, we can get a reasonable sense of what may have occurred, or my apologies, the recall of a child, of how they experienced that scenario, what they witnessed, and then not going out and confusing that 12 months later or beyond, of saying, now as an older person, we've put in scripts and you've been asked the same questions 101 times by everyone under the sun, including your parents, who are, wildly concerned for you and want to look after you and so on. We're not muddying the waters. We can actually get something very early on, versus that adversarial style, which is, say nothing, you don't give a police statement, you immediately have a lawyer that's there, and we're prepping for what might come up, and it just becomes this circus. It seems that it's a bit more inquisitorial from that sense of saying, how can we guard against this for young, vulnerable children, to get an understanding of what they witnessed, and then not have to put them on the stand and beat them up, or manipulate and so on. I'm being a bit harsh here, but
well, I think like they still do the cross-examination.
They still do.
They still do, and which is pre-recorded as well. But at least it is not in a courtroom. And of course, they already had those adjustments that they could be cross-examined via CCTV, so they didn't have to be in the courtroom. But now it's pre-recorded. It's already taken care of. Children don't have to worry about, indeed, a year and a half later, when so many things have happened. Sometimes it's like it can be years later when it comes forward, or it's awful. So at least they have it all done within a safer environment. And
how is that? How is that set up, if you don't mind me asking? Like how how do they set up that environment, and who's present usually in those scenarios?
So I don't know all the specifics, but the judge is there, the prosecutor, the defense barrister, an intermediary. I don't believe that the parents are there, but the intermediary is there. Well, the parents are outside, but not in the same room. And it can be... I'm just thinking it can be a room in the courts, or it can be a room in another environment, but I don't 100% sure on the specific room setup.
Okay. So it's still quite adversarial, but
yes,
it's still trying to protect the child a little bit more.
It is protecting the child, first of all, because they also don't have to do it repeatedly and come back. Like, it's just a one-off. This is when it happens and it's done. It's all pre-recorded. And from now on, this is their statement. This is their evidence in chief. This is their cross-examination. So it's just like done and dusted early on. And in the best possible way for the child, rather than having to have that always hanging above your head that you have to go. And
I can see how that could be a lot more protective for children, that they don't have to carry that or be burdened by that, be fearful of that. They don't have to continue to talk about it necessarily, that of how they have to participate in the future. It kind of just gets done, and then they don't have to return. Still quite daunting though. It sounds like not everyone has to necessarily behave during that. But yeah, they want to behave a little bit because
Yeah,
otherwise it kind of ruins
the
the
whole
validity of
process.
it.
Yeah,
They have to kind of behave to a level, because it will be shown in the court later on of saying this is how the child was interviewed, or this is the evidence,
yeah,
the child's evidence,
yeah.
or that's how it will be presented.
Yes.
But at the same time, yeah,
No,
gosh,
it's
it's still pretty daunting.
it's so daunting. And what you said about like the inquisitorial system, I'm originally from the Netherlands, and they have, if they could create something like that over here, it would be really great. Where actually, when the child first, we've got an inquisitorial system in the Netherlands, and when it actually comes to the police, there is already a group of psychologists, both research and clinical psychologists, and then also social workers, police officers and lawyers are within that group, and they actually look at the interview, they look at the investigation, and then depending on what they find, they actually decide if it should go to a court case or not, or if it should be dealt with in another way. And it's really early on, and the whole emphasis is to see, well, what is the best outcome within this context, like how reliable is the evidence already, would it stand up to the scrutiny when it goes to court, but also like what can we do to help the vulnerable person that has made the accusation within this context. It's a very different approach because you take it so early on, and you're just making sure that you protect everybody involved within that case, and not put anyone like through a lot of issues for cases to be undetermined, or that it goes to a retrial or anything like that, which is less likely in the Netherlands anyway, because we don't have a jury system, and we don't have juries in the inquisitorial system either. So, but yeah, I sometimes think the adversarial system is a very punitive system, not for the defendant, but technically for anyone else involved. It's so stressful, and it really is set towards people who have enough money to be best represented. And it isn't actually set up to protect the victim survivors in these situations at all, which is
Is
unfortunate.
is there, and I don't understand this world, so hopefully you can shine a bit of a light on it. But in the inquisitorial system, is there still is it inquisitorial in terms of trying to collect the, with an understanding of, we're trying to understand what the facts are, within an inquisitorial manner rather than a adversarial manner, and then after you can still have an adversarial points of view in terms of you still argue a point of view afterwards, or the whole thing is we're just trying to find out in an inquisitorial manner, and then from that we take that as being the best guess about what has occurred, because we're guessing no matter which way, and obviously that's why there's these thresholds of saying, beyond reasonable doubt or whatever the other version is. What's the difference there? And I'm assuming there's challenges in both, as there often are in when there's two main systems.
Absolutely. So if you look within our adversarial system in Australia, you've got the police does an investigation. They collect all the evidence, interview all the witnesses, interview the suspects, the victims, and then create a police brief. Based on the brief, that's when they press charges or decide to press charges, but they hand over the brief to the prosecution. And prosecution is technically completely separate from the police. They go by the brief, via the brief, and then they actually take it to trial. And in trial, it's prosecution against defense. They both argue their case. So when the brief is presented by police, it's both presented to prosecution and also to defense. So they should get exactly the same evidence, and they then prepare their cases to go to trial. Within the inquisitorial system, the prosecutor technically works together with the police, and they actually direct the police to determine who should be interviewed, who they should be talking to, what else kind of information that they need, and together they prepare the case against the defendants. This is then also under guidance of the judge. And when you look at the court case, so in Australia, in the adversarial system, you've got the judge at the front who is facing both prosecution and defense, and then you've got the jury on the sides. Within the inquisitorial system, at least in the Netherlands, you've got the judge, and next to the judge is actually the prosecutor, who is then talking to the defendant, who sits at like facing the judge with their barrister. So it is less of like the two parties and the judge is deciding on it, but it's actually the judge who leads the prosecutor, slightly different name in Dutch, and then the prosecutor who's guiding the police. So they are all like talking to each other, really like trying to like be inquisitive, trying to find out what has happened, collecting all the details. The judge can direct the prosecutor to say, I need more information on this, or make sure to also talk to that person. And then they create the case, which is then laid towards the defendant and the barrister, and then they can give their version of events, what happened as well.
Does that mean it doesn't act as a trial in essence, that the parties would come together and then more information would be sought, and then they kind of go off and they come back together and more information is sought, or it's actually all gathered at the time of, the judge and the prosecutor?
Yeah. So they
obviously are guided by the judge in terms of what's the information that's pertinent to this.
Yeah,
it's important to be understood.
Yeah, it's mostly the prosecutor, but the judge can give directions at a certain point, but it's all done before it comes towards the judge. So at that point, the judge can then say, do this more, like, oh, I need more information on this, but it's mostly done during the like actual court case. Witnesses are also not necessarily cross-examined, as like not the same way that they cross-examined within the adversarial system, but they still are being asked to provide statements. There's direct questions. The judge can also ask direct questions to the witnesses. That is a lot more it's more normally the judge within the adversarial system refrains from intervening. It's mostly the prosecutor and the defense barrister asking questions. But within the inquisitorial system, the judge is when they ask questions throughout the trial as well. And it's the majority is done before it actually gets to the court case. Yeah.
And is the idea that they still explore both sides, so that does the judge is the role of the judge to try and entertain both sides, similar to what an adversarial system does as well? How does it differ in that? Like, obviously, I get it when there's a defendant and a prosecutor. The defense only holds one side, and they, they'll throw any trick under the sun, and so do the prosecutors. It's such a battle, and sometimes, both sides are trying to put what they believe is important information in front of the court. Some to muddy the waters, others to go out and say, well, this is just a fact that really does need to be considered. It's quite complicated as to which one's the actual fact and which one's is there designed to actually just muddy the waters, because they're trying to say that both are the same thing. It's it's awful. It's adversarial. You're fighting with each other. There's tension, there's anger, there's all sorts of things going on. How are both sides reflected, or it doesn't need both sides to be reflected in a inquisitorial? Sorry, these might be a bit naive questions.
No, absolutely. And it's like,
I've read about it, but I don't.
And I can also only go by like what I know from the Netherlands. So like there's other countries that. So it's still considered like it's technically, these are the facts, and this is the problem, because there's still issues with inquisitorial system. It's not debatable what system is better, but it doesn't solve all the issues that we see in the adversarial system. Sure. But technically you still have this is the case that prosecution and the prosecutor together with the police has put together. These are all the facts that we found, and the idea is that the police doesn't go try out to prove necessarily your guilt, but they just like they present the facts of the case as they are there that show the likelihood that this person is guilty. And the prosecutor creates a case, but they are just like positioned in a different way, and it's less about them, the two narratives that they have, and it's more an opportunity for like the defense then to go into a discussion about like where they think that the facts are wrongly represented, or where they believe that things have gone wrong, or why they think that their client isn't guilty based on what is presented, or facts that they might have that the prosecution hasn't taken into consideration. If you look at the adversarial system, where they both get the brief and they both spin their own narrative around the brief, and it is like two stories are being told against each other. Inquisitorial, it's more like a discussion. What is about, well, this is what we found, this is what we have at this point. And then it's like, well, how as defense do you respond to this, rather than trying to like that the focus is really on trying to find like an opposite narrative towards the other person. I think in the end, that's what it still comes to, because you're trying to explain the same facts. Right, if it's inquisitorial or adversarial, we're still working with the same proven facts, allegedly, and we are trying to work around the story about what happens. But I feel while the adversarial is really one's against the other, competing, the judge sits there, well, the jury makes a decision, or if it's a judge-only trial, the judge makes a decision about how they believe. This is more a discussion about the about how the facts and the possibilities of that this person has committed this crime. Sorry, it's all quite removed from the original topic.
Yeah, well, I asked the question because obviously it's pertinent to the idea of how do we protect vulnerable people, because it doesn't just relate to children. That there are, I mean, in many ways, I would say that everyone in the legal profession, anyone that gets caught up in this legal world is doing it usually for the first time, and it's so daunting and it's frightening. They're trying to get it right. The stakes are high. Most people have already got a position that they formulated in their mind as they want to uphold. We're humans, so we do this right, wrong, good, bad. This is true, this is false sort of scenario, and those biases, come into the room are so painful. Let alone then I'm trying to do what's right and wrong in a system I don't understand. Even the whole concept of people think that evidence is anything that is said versus it needs to be adopted, it needs to be accepted as evidence. Even that is not understood very widely.
It is a weird concept,
isn't it? It's like, I scratch my head. I'm like, I don't understand this legal world at all, let alone, and I've at least had a little bit of exposure, just through my interest, but most people have had zero, and they understand nothing about it. Like there's all these rules that they have no privilege to. And here's an interesting one that I had no idea, that blew my mind when I found out that a person that I know who was going to court for damages with regards to something that had occurred to them in their childhood. And they came to a point in I suppose the legal system where they either accepted what was being offered on the table pre-court, or they went to court. And at that point, their counsel advised them that if you actually go to court now, and we don't get a successful result, you could be now liable for the other party's costs, and that might mean your home and everything else, because the costs are very high. So, yet we can't even tell you, because there would have to be a fairly big disparity between what they're providing you and what the final outcome. So even if you did have a final outcome, if it came close to what was being offered, their costs might be factored into you now being liable for it. I was like, oh my goodness. And I get it, because that does place a burden on you. People can't just be vexatious and say anything. But it's like, oh my goodness, shouldn't that have been understood a little bit earlier and at the same time, there's probably an infinite number of things that can't be understood. So, when we're talking about trying to protect participants in the legal system, young people, obviously that's a very obvious one, but I would say adults as well. Even the clever ones think they're clever, but they don't necessarily understand this whole new language or rule set. It's so complex, and I'd love to hear about what your thoughts are in terms of how do we do that. Or what does the court currently maybe do to try and make that, create a space? Because obviously the idea I'm assuming of the court is to serve the community and understand what is, what has occurred, and produce an outcome that is good for the community. And that doesn't necessarily mean jail time. It could be anything. They're like, what's good for our community.
So there is a lot of emphasis nowadays on protecting vulnerable witnesses and victim survivors, or providing them with a fair access to justice. And there's different ways that can be done. So there's a lot of people, they're working in a lot of different states within Australia now with intermediaries that make sure that technically they are able there to, when a witness or victim is being cross-examined, but also just being interviewed, when they have to provide their statements, that they are being asked questions in ways that they can understand. That if certain things overstep or go the wrong way, that the intermediary can step in and can direct the lawyers to ask the question in a different way, or to use words that are better understandable. And these are for vulnerabilities like cognitive disabilities, or it can be like different types of psychological aspects that can be going on, but also due to the nature of the crime that they've experienced or witnessed. And this is especially within sexual assault, historical sexual assault. We also see that we have with these types of cases, witnesses and victim survivors are allowed to have support persons, and in some courts even support animals there when they testify. And this is of course to make sure, like, to try to counteract the traumatizing impact that testifying and being cross-examined about these facts can have. But what you brought up is a really good point, and that is even just like social legal education, having a better understanding of the processes. A lot of prosecutor officers, so Department of Public Prosecutors, have like witness and victim survivor like little guidelines. They specifically, I know in a couple of courts within New South Wales, they do great work with specifically for victims of domestic and family violence, where they have these court clinics where they actually get people together that have to go and testify in their cases, and they show them what the courtroom looks like, who is going to be standing where, what type of questions are being asked. The victim survivor can ask all the different questions that they might have just about what happens in court, what type of questions, what they will be asked, what they have to answer, or what they can say, I don't know to. And it is especially these types of things, like you go into the stand and it's not just you not remembering stuff, but it's also not knowing exactly what the rules are. What are you allowed to say to a lawyer? Can you say, oh, I don't want to answer that? Or can they really push you to provide an answer even if you don't know the answer? So it's those certain uncertainties that they are educating within these clinics, and that is specifically for victim survivors of domestic and family violence. And then there's also broader like witness counseling and guidelines and guidance when they come to court for vulnerable victim survivors. At the same time, I think it's also very important for suspects to get similar similar like protective, not services, but like guidelines there. We often see that especially vulnerable suspects it's difficult for them to act in their own best interest. And you could argue everyone that comes in contact with the legal system, as you said, is vulnerable because it's such an unfamiliar, daunting situation that you're in. And I think a lot of us, the one thing that we would do, especially if we become a suspect and we might be innocent, but we're a suspect, is I'll just talk to the police. And once they hear my story, they find out that I'm actually innocent. But with that, you actually set aside a lot of your rights and you might not actually be acting in your best interest, especially if you are innocent, by thinking that you'll clear it up because the system is not set up to facilitate that. Once you're a suspect, it's a very specific route that's being taken and approach that's being taken to your interview, to finding certain evidence against you. And it is very important that we protect people in all those situations to give them the best possible access to justice. Sorry if that's a bit vague.
No, it definitely makes sense, because the ease in which we can go out and make errors is often based on not knowing the rules. And anyone can write an essay on either side, for or against capital punishment, and there's really compelling evidence in both scenarios. We just write a good essay on it. And I bet you can quote, really prominent people and research and all sorts of stuff. So it's not difficult to hire someone who can write a very, compelling argument. The problem is we're trying to actually support people in understanding the, what has occurred, and that gets complicated when there's children or, for example, adults who are trying to now talk about what happened as a child. So in some sense, we're talking to an adult about a child experience and how they to recall, and at the same time protect the accused. And that's a very complicated thing to do in both, because we've seen, lots of instances where humans behave badly, and just, there's enough of us that some will, and trying to do this in a way where justice can occur, or the truth will prevail in most instances is incredibly difficult. And also not to harm people along the way, like harming children. I love the idea of we do it early for children, so they don't have to bear that burden. But at the same time, I imagine things have to be prepped early as well. Why that couldn't be afforded to adults, because their memory is going to fracture as well. Just because you're an adult doesn't make you unbiased. No. And I also spoke with one of your colleagues about even how evidence is demonstrated these days. And, I've seen, some of the shenanigans in the States of how they, the bigger the screen that they bring out, or these big cardboard sort of effective like banners of showing a tweet or something or other, to make the impact so visceral and enormous. All these crazy tactics, and so even questions about how you design a courtroom, and having some standardization so that everyone has the same, a big screen, which is helpful for everyone to observe, can also be very daunting, because also you can push a particular button and we're going to all exploit it, knowing that. So, having standards about, how big are the evidence props, because they are props. It's a theater.
It is.
That you can bring in. I actually spoke with my apologies. I listened to a barrister on the weekend in some training that I was doing, and he was talking about how, they are extremely theatrical, and even though they're not allowed to move outside of their box, so to speak, they will do things like lean in, or they'll even put their back toward the witness, like, dismissing them, how they use their arms and tone, and volume, all these things. And, he spoke very frankly, which was quite nice, because I think, it it opened up to just how they do it, and he specifically called it theatrics. That they use theatrics.
Was this in Australia or in the United States?
It was in Australia.
That's amazing. Yeah, I know.
Obviously this is part of training, so
Yeah.
but we all know it, because all you got to do is observe it, and no one acts that way where you turn your back to someone, but you look in a courtroom and these absurdities going on in this space. I scratch my head and go, how do people behave like this?
But also, like, we all know about it, and people on the jury also know about it, but you're still being influenced by it.
It is, yeah.
And that's the problem with it, is that even that you are aware, you cannot help but have it influence your decision making and how you interpret the situation, because it's just like that unconscious bias that it feeds into towards
It's that whole, throw some mud. I put it to you that you were angry, you were furious at the time, weren't you? It's like, well, now you've just put that out in the air. Everyone's heard that I was furious and angry.
But also, even
I might say no, but
yeah.
I don't get to, I don't get to turn around and say, well, I put it to you that I wasn't. I was calm and I was, quite grounded, and they don't let you do that,
I know. And then even the words, like, I put it to you, like, that is such a weird thing.
What is that?
It's just, I never understood that. I'm like, that is so right. It's so wrong. So weird. And then with the children, they used to do that as well in cross-examination. Can you imagine if you've got like a 4-year-old and they're sitting there on the stand, and because that was what was happening, and then you've got one with a little weird wig that says, I put it to you. And you're like, I'm sorry, how can they understand even what that means if an adult doesn't quite understand what it means?
Yeah. How are false memories created? What is that? I mean, that's a space that is that a term that talks about that someone just believes that something occurred that didn't occur, or is it something that if you are questioned about something for long enough, or if you're running with a particular narrative, that you just start to create additional scripts? For example, like, if something happened 9 months ago and I'm wedded on what happened in that coffee shop, I could genuinely believe, no, I spoke with this person because I usually speak with that person, and like, what does false memories mean? Maybe we can start even there.
Okay. So because you threw in like a lot of different aspects that we look at within research. So false memories in research, we talk about when you have a full memory of an event or something happening that never actually happens. And this is detailed. This is not just a false belief. So you believe something happened, but actually, when you think about it, you can, like that video recorder, you can actually see it play back in your mind, like, oh, this is what happened to me.
A whole event.
Oh, usually a whole event, yes, or at least a sequence of events. We mostly...
Is that usually like a couple of minutes? Is that like when we talk about an event?
It can detail, so it can change. So research has differed from implanting false memories of people going up in a hot air balloon ride, and they were told, or they came to believe that they went into a hot air balloon and went off the road, like at a country fair, went up in the sky, looked around for a little bit and came down again. People have come to believe that they got their fingers trapped in a mouse trap when they were playing outside. They have come to believe that they had been attacked by a dog and bitten and had to go to hospital. And researchers have even made children believe that they had been abducted by a UFO for a while and then had been returned home after a while. And children will elaborate on that. So usually within the false memory research paradigm, what researchers do is they speak to parents or people that know the participant very well. They get 2 or 3 events that have actually happened. So this can be, for example, a birthday party or a family holiday or a specific event. And then they also come up with one event and they verify with their family members that this actually never happened to that person. Then for a few weeks in a row, they will repeatedly interview the participant about all 4 events. So the 3 events that actually happened to the person and the one that they made up, and they use different techniques. So they can use context reinstatement, which, for example, is like, it's very common that people don't remember certain things, but just try to think back about the situation. What did it smell like? How did you feel like? What were the different things that you can see? Trying to reinstate the context of that event, even though it never happens. And they do that, they use very suggestive and leading type of things, like, what kind of people would you have spoken to, like insinuating that there were people. They can sometimes also use doctored photos. So, for example, with the hot air balloon rides, what they did is they showed photos, 3 real photos of their childhood events that they got from their family members, and then 1 doctored photo where they put the participant as a little kid within the hot air balloon and say, look, you were in this hot air balloon. What can you tell me about that ride? And they do that over a few weeks' time, and then they just ask them to recall. And what you see is that over time, about 1 in 4 people actually come to remember and have vivid memories and extra details about that go beyond of the little information that you provided them with. And they stay and they keep on remembering that. So that's about 1 in 4 adults. And we see with children, that's about like 1 in 4 to 1 in 3 children start to remember these types of events.
How does that occur in the real world? Obviously, I can see that suggestibility occurring where, little by little over several weeks, and obviously something so powerful as like, photoshopped images is going to be powerful because it kind of says it must be true. So therefore, let me look and recall other elements of that, and we've got other scripts. So I must have been with mum and dad, and we just kind of populate the rest of it, as we do with everything. Where there's a gap, we fill it. How does that happen in the real world?
So it can happen in various ways. So one actually really famous example is from Jean Piaget, who is a very famous developmental psychologist, and he came up with a couple of tasks to measure cognitive development in young children. So he was actually abducted when he was a baby. So he was out with his nanny, and then his nanny came home one day to the parents and said, somebody stole Piaget, Jean, in his little pram, and took off with him, and then they found him back. Turns out he was never actually abducted, but she was gambling or something like that, and she left him outside in his pram. But he actually had a vivid memory of being abducted and of the abductors and what they look like and everything like that. So that is a real life example, but it's also other things. Like, often stories get told between family members, and they are like, oh yeah, I remember that specific birthday party, but people make mistakes and they mix it up, and then you can come to remember that something actually happened to you, what might have happened to your brother or your sister or to someone else, just because a story like kind of got retold in a certain way that wasn't actually quite correct. I've got a friend, and she's like, she traveled a lot when she was a child with her family, and she remembers that she went to the Grand Canyon with her parents, and she says, I know what it felt like. I know that I was standing there. I was looking at the Grand Canyon, and she's been to America heaps of times as a child with her family. And then when she was talking one day to her parents about, the time that we visited the Grand Canyon, and they were like, we've never been there. We've been to LA, and to Vegas, but we never actually went to see the Grand Canyon. So I don't know. And she has a vivid memory of it. It's actually informed also other things where people have been told that this memory wasn't real. And they say, I know this memory wasn't real, so they don't believe it, but they still have the memory when they think back about it. It's like, but I was standing there. So there's this non-believed memory type of thing where you have this whole sensory experience of something that happened to you, but you know it never happens, which is really weird. And that is slightly different than, for example, when we've got gaps in our memory for an event, and by suggestions, people are changing details. So I thought it would, I know I saw a car. I don't remember what the color was. You said, it was a red car. And in my memory, it becomes a red car.
Sure. That's just going out. Yeah.
Yeah.
One is kind of putting in doubt or leading, and then you kind of I'll just take on that bit of information.
Yeah.
Where the other one, over time, it almost becomes like there's lots of scripts that are there, or sometimes even none, as you mentioned as well, but there's at least enough references of something having happened, and over time
You actually
something
come to
sticks
believe.
and it
Yeah.
begins to kind of develop more and more detail, and
Yeah.
then it starts to actually feel like it did occur.
And you
And
actually have a memory.
objectively, there are objective measures to say, no, you never saw you were never at the Grand Canyon,
Yeah.
not with your parents.
Yeah. And I think, like, you, even if somebody suggests something to you and you accept, and we call that misinformation, and you accept the misinformation and integrate it into your memory, and this is now part of your memory, you can say that's a false memory for that specific detail. But I like to think of that like, accepting misinformation, and more when we talk about false memories, thinking about these rich false memories about whole events. If you really like go into the nitty-gritty, you, like, as soon as you remember something that wasn't there and integrate it, then you can say that is a false memory. But it's more semantics towards like what you would constitute as a false memory or not.
Yeah, but it almost feels like a false memory is more about something that stands alone, that hasn't occurred, versus something that kind of did happen, but there's some vagueness about who was there or wasn't, and it becomes
or
bit,
you misremember details, or you have accepted misinformation about details that were there, which is technically still a false memory. If I like,
sure,
but yeah, I think I'm very intrigued by the whole events where all of a sudden you would just have a memory of being abducted by UFOs, and your whole classroom was there. This is the little kids that started. They had about 1 in 5 kids starting to believe they were abducted by UFOs, and had very strong stories. And even after debriefing, a lot of kids still believed they had been abducted by a UFO, which was quite interesting.
wow.
Adults as well, by the way. You can make them believe things like that too.
How often are these occurring? I know that you said that 1 in 4 can kind of create that when they're put into that condition. So that's obviously, talks to a certain susceptibility and but you're also in a very strong controlled environment that's actively trying to achieve that, and is trying to trick you, right? And it's very compelling, versus it happening in the real world, because obviously a series of things have to build on one another for someone to begin to believe that. It's not like you just wake up and you go, this happened to me. It sounds like it builds over time rather than a spontaneous false memory shows up, or does it happen that way as well?
There are spontaneous self-generated false memories, like they can happen, but what you see and what really brought about the research is that people came, and this is around the 90s especially, people went into therapy because they had certain feelings, and then very suggestive therapy techniques were used, and often hypnosis. And during those types of hypnosis, they then came to recover specific memories of childhood sexual abuse or other types of things. And what we see in real life cases, the one that we have, is that people created false memories for whole events under these very suggestive hypnotic type of therapy techniques. What you also see, and this was how a lot of the research with the kids came about, is that they started, like, one child made a disclosure in a specific case. Police interviewed them, then went up to the parents of the preschool and said, this has happened to one of the kids here. Please all go home and talk to your children and make sure it didn't happen to them, which is, of course, not a very good thing to do. So, of course, parents were very panicky. They started then talking to their children. They were asking very suggestive questions because they were told by police to technically do this. This is in the 80s. Sure. Then the kids came forward. Police were then interviewing the children by saying, your friend told me that this happened to him at school. Can you tell me what remember? Providing specific details from what one child told in the interview of the other children. They took on that information and then started confabulating even more, so came up with more details. And before you know it, you had a whole classroom of children all making very similar accusations with a lot of details. And because they were so consistent, the police was like, well, something must be going on here, not realizing that how they interviewed and technically cross-contaminated all of the statements from the children by providing information that other kids had given. And the problem with cases like that is that the very first original disclosure could be very correct, but now you've contaminated everything by using these types of interviewing techniques. And that happened quite a lot in the 80s, early 90s. And because of that, all these like interviewing techniques were introduced, all the research came about to, well, how can we prevent this from happening? How should we interview children? And that is why all these new introductions have happened.
And that all almost goes full circle about understanding that children in actual fact are quite good witnesses and quite reliable witnesses.
Yep.
But it's the adults who need to be very cognizant about how do you interview children, how do you ask questions, when do you ask questions, how they're supported to provide their experience in their account, and also how easy it is to falsify memories, or at least confuse them if we don't use those right language sets, and looking after the vulnerable, more so looking after the court. We're trying to get a good result for the community, and the best way to do that is through individuals not being pressured, not the adversarial, but trying to be respectful for young people and adults alike. But in actual fact, the full circle is children are reliable. We've got to give them an opportunity to be reliable. They're actually good witnesses, and they're actually honest witnesses. Especially in that sort of promise scenario, there's a likelihood of them trying to tell the truth. They're kind of primed that way, and not making it punitive or even couching like responding to them is a great danger. Trying to be neutral so that there isn't a sign of you're doing good, you're doing bad, because they're so in tune with that. They want to be good participants, which can obviously it's cute, but it can make a lot of problems as well. Celine, where can people find out more about this? I know that you've written about this as well. What are some good texts, books that we can look at? Children as witnesses, their reliability, memory, adults, the legal system. I'm asking for a lot, but some of our listeners might want to continue reading on and are intrigued to find out more.
I've got colleagues at Griffith University that have a center of investigative interviewing that do, if you're very interested in, they have really good and cute short introductory, or not introductory, but short videos that tell you about, for example, interviewing children. But also like different issues with interviewing specific vulnerable suspects. They're very short, they're easy to understand, but give you a lot of good information if you just want to have like quick fix on those types of things. There is if you're interested in vulnerability within the legal system, I've written a book about interviewing vulnerable suspects, which might be interesting. Happy to provide you a link to that as well. It's written for legal practitioners specifically, and providing like handy guidelines on how to adjust how you're talking and interviewing people that have specific vulnerabilities.
And where can people find a copy of that? Is that online? Is it?
There are e-copies available to buy. There's also hard copies. I should know this.
No, that's fine. But the title is Interviewing Vulnerable Suspects.
Interviewing Vulnerable Suspects, yes. And I'm happy to provide you with a link towards the publisher website. It's Routledge Publishers. I've done quite some work as well on adults' memory for repeated events. So this is victim survivors of domestic and family violence. So got some articles if you want to, like, if you Google my name, they will come up as well. Then specifically children, it's I think it's very interesting, like this new program that is being developed within New South Wales, to make sure that we have the early pre-recording of the evidence in chief. If you go to the Department of Public Prosecutors website, they have quite a lot of information on that trial, and useful information just if you want to know more about that. And legal comparative type stuff. I'm thinking about what a good source would be to read. Can't think about it like immediately. False memories research. I think the godmother of false memory research is Elizabeth Loftus. She has done a lot of interviews, but also a lot of articles for academics, but also laymen that just want to read more about it. So if you Google her name, you will come across, but I can also send you some articles that might be interesting if you have a opportunity to share them. And I'll think about the legal system one, and which would be a good one to have a look into.
Yeah, wonderful. That's fantastic. Yeah, any links that you can share, we're happy to provide them to our listeners. And one final thing before I let you go, for those who might one day find themselves needing to act as a witness, or be on the stand, or those that maybe looking at that in the future, what advice would you give them, understanding about the system, memories, how we perform under pressure, obviously the theatrics. What do you think is a good way to try and be in those scenarios, understanding that there's a lot that's going on for most, that it's their first time?
I think one thing that's really important to do, this is rather you're a witness, a victim survivor, if it's for a one-off or for a repeated event, is note down your recollection of the event as soon as you can after you've witnessed it or after you've experienced the event, when it's safe to do so. You can scribble it down on paper, you can make a voice note on your phone or write it down on your phone, but just try to write it down, because as I mentioned, our memory starts to decay very rapidly. So if you can do that within the first few hours after you've experienced or witnessed it, you have the most accurate recollection of your memory that you'll ever get. Once you have that, it can be a contemporaneous note, and you can actually use it as a memory aid even when you have to provide your testimony. When you're speaking to, it is tricky. When you're speaking to police, know that especially with specific, if you're a witness, like, you can have a support person there. You are allowed to have a support person with you if you need one when you're talking to police. If you become a suspect for one reason or another, don't talk until you have spoken to legal representation. It's not like in America, like, I want a lawyer present. Like, there's different rules and regulations here, but you do not have to talk. You do not have to engage. And don't think that just explaining what has happened might help you, but make sure that you have spoken to a legal representative for yourself before you actually engage within a discussion. When you actually go to court, depending on the courts that you go to, they often actually have victim and witness counselors that actually will help you and introduce you to the specific courtroom or show you what's going on. They can actually also sit with you, like, in between, if you're not allowed to sit in the courtroom, but you have to wait outside. So in the waiting room for the witnesses or the people that have to testify, they can sit with you and take up on those opportunities. Like, often you feel like, oh, it looks silly, or people can be embarrassed to take up these opportunities, but please engage with them, because they are specifically there because this is a situation that you're not used to, and you're not expected to be used to it or to know about it. So like, if there's an opportunity to engage with that, try to do it, because it can really help. Once you understand, it is to, like, the whole point of our adversarial system is to create a doubt about your statement, and every question is there to, like, even make yourself doubt your own answers and your own memories. So you do not have to reply straight away. Like, sit, take a breath before you answer. Just think about what have they actually asked you. And if you don't know the answer, it is completely okay to say, I don't know, within the court. And they might keep on going about that fact, but it's all right, because that is how our human memory works. And it is fine to take your time, to not be rushed by those people, by those legal practitioners trying to push you into answering or getting an answer from you, and to just take a breath and recollect and say, don't know if you don't know.
Absolutely incredible advice. I think, going from all the way to recording your memory as soon as you can. That's why, even as a clinical psychologist, it's important that I write my notes as soon as I can, because, my memory will fade, things will be thrown out that were important, things might be added that I think were maybe discussed. It's just important to do that, because our memory is very fallible if not treated with respect, and it needs to be treated early, or understood that its best performance will be early. But I think also what you say in terms of having an assurance that, inform yourself before you go out and give any statements. Make sure that you speak to your own counsel, and I like that idea of taking up the opportunity of having those supports. We know that we're social beings, so don't be embarrassed by having someone there to support you, familiarizing yourself, and that fantastic advice about taking a breath. I've heard it in other instances where people say, when you ask the question, repeat the question back to yourself in your own voice before you answer, so you can get a chance to understand the question, because the questions are even formulated in such a way that can be difficult to understand what is the question being asked. So I think that idea of pausing, taking a breath is important. It's been an absolute pleasure, Celine, to speak with you. Appreciate your amazing knowledge in this space, and particularly, looking at the vulnerable, children and adults alike. And I like the fact that you see the immense case of looking after both. And, as much as we want to protect children immensely, we were children to ourselves, and it is scary, especially if you're a victim, especially if something awful has occurred to you, or on the other side, you're being accused of something that haven't done. That is awful in nature. It's frightening. So, thank you for your work and research, and sharing it with me today, and obviously our listeners. Hopefully we can see some of those changes as well in time. And it sounds like that's occurring. So that, there's some positivity around, how we do this. Yes, it remains adversarial, but there are some better elements, or some more considered elements, particularly for the young, that we're beginning to introduce. So that's optimistic.
Absolutely. And thank you for having me. I really enjoyed this chat.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please support it by going to iTunes and putting a review, subscribe, share it via social media, and tell others about it. Start a conversation. It's listeners like you that make this able and possible, and why we bring in these guests to go out and share their knowledge and resources. And just lastly, if you are a psychologist and you want to go out and be part of a bigger team, develop your experience and get into some exciting work, come to strategicpsychology.com.au/careers and reach out. I'd love to hear from you.